Hey students, welcome to today's video going over, actually this is going to be part 2 of chapter 16 of Living with Art by Mark Getlein. This is going to be the second half of the Renaissance. It's kind of the big one. We left off part 1 talking about Michelangelo. We were kind of winding down Michelangelo actually. And we finished up talking about the Sistine Chapel and the way that he finished the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And then several years later, about 20 years later, he also completed this piece, The Last Judgment, which by contrast against what we saw in the Sistine Chapel is much more busy, much more fraught, and much more emotional and dramatic. There's more like storytelling happening. This is actually the story of Revelations, and there's just a lot more kind of drama happening, and the strange like man carrying the skin and the demon figures and things. It's quite a bit different than the more like subtle just images of the characters, of this like Adam and God and like simple one figure stories. But in any case, yeah, so this was done later, and it's actually that fullness, right, that the like it's really a jam-packed, like crowded feeling in this painting. It's indicative of what's going to start to happen as we move to the later part of the Renaissance, as we sort of close out the high Renaissance. So kind of remember this, the drama and the crowdedness. Now, Michelangelo actually, remember the Sistine Chapel is a part of St. Peter's Basilica. He works on, he does the facade. I think there's a staircase that he does out back, and he does have a dome design, but he passes away in 1564 before he actually can finish the dome and all the parts. So the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, or the main like Cathedral of the Vatican City, is completed in 1519 by Giacomo della Porta. But anyway, that kind of closes out Michelangelo. So that was 3 turtles down. So let's talk about just the last turtle we're going to mention, Raphael. We've looked at the School of Athens before, I think. Yeah, we have before as part of our perspective chapter. And the School of Athens is essentially, it's kind of Raphael's version of a flex on the whole perspective thing, right? What we really see as the main point of this painting is, well, number one, Raphael is mainly known as a painter, and he largely works for the Vatican City, but he also just has this sort of, he embraces humanism and the philosophies of ancient Greek and Roman philosophers. So that's what we're seeing here, is right. It's as if all of the Greek and Roman philosophers of old times and the stories related to them are there in person on this sort of stairwell, and it's the School of Athens, right? That's the idea. And in this, he does create this perspective where, again, the philosophers Plato and Aristotle take the center stage, and they behind them would be the point towards which all of the things that are in perspective going away from us are going to the point behind them, which is on the horizon line. And we know that because that's everybody here is in line, and the people up close are smaller. And there's actually another flex that's pretty cool that Raphael included here, besides the philosophers and the perspective. He also included one of the first instances of 2-point perspective, like a little subtle thing down here where he turned to this box so that, when you're looking at the corner of something, it's no longer just 1 point, it's a little bit 2-point. Now, they were still figuring it all out, so it's not like wild, it's pretty subtle, but it's interesting to see here. Now, Raphael, that School of Athens is sort of his big claim to fame. He does several sculptures, and he eventually does become the court painter of Pope Leo X. And that's sort of how Raphael winds down his career. And so in this, from 1500 to 1540, we get Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Donatello was quite a bit earlier. And those are all of our Ninja Turtles. And that sort of closes out the Renaissance. Actually, they say that the High Renaissance ends officially when Raphael dies. Okay, which I'm not sure exactly what year it was, but it's I know Michelangelo dies in 64, so sometime after that. Now, in addition to Rome and Florence, we should also talk about another artistic center. Now, like I said, we've gotten through our big like rock star artists, but Bellini is definitely worth noting as a Venetian artist. The third great artistic center of Italy was Venice, and in Venice, we talked about how it's its own republic, but it's this seaside port city with lots of commerce and its own culture outside of Rome and Florence. But yes, we let's talk about the landscapes are really the thing that becomes so much different about Venetian art. There's a large focus on landscape, and specifically, we see there Bellini. He's showing Saint Francis, but Saint Francis is less important than the overall like image. The figures of these Venetian painters are much smaller. So here's Saint Francis in the desert, and then here's Giorgione's The Tempest. And here you can really see his contribution to Renaissance art. While most artists of earlier generations would compose a scene by concentrating on the figure and then filling in the landscape behind it as sort of a backdrop, Giorgione and the other Venetian painters would actually go construct the landscape. They would actually basically go paint the landscape, and then they would place small figures into the landscape. So there was just this subtle flip where the focus was the landscape and the figures were filled in after the fact. So they're minor, they're often sort of just like randomly placed, right? And here we see this storm and the woman nursing with the man sort of passing by, and it's just sort of a little mini drama happening, in the foreground while the background is this storm brewing. Now, Titian, another Venetian artist who really kind of like encapsulates the Renaissance in Venice. He does these scenes well, and actually he does several kind of more typical biblical scenes, but this one here we highlight that in his landscape scene we actually see a couple of things happening that are a little different. First off, this isn't a biblical story. This is some poets sort of, frolicking about, right? And actually, what I like to talk about in this piece is what was different about Florence and Venice from Rome is that, and especially in Venice, is that it lay outside the Papal States. So the Medici had some influence in Venice, and they actually held more sway. The aristocrats working in Venice actually held more sway than the church did, right? So that's important in setting up. We look at this. What the Medici did in Venice is essentially in the Republic of Venice. They had mines and factories and things for dyeing fabrics. Okay, and so when we look at this particular piece, while that center character is not necessarily of a ton of importance, by himself, he actually represents the commercial strength of the Medici there in Venice because of the fabric that he is wearing, right? So there's a couple of things happening again. And then also notice that there is a little bit of a different vibe to the nudes in this piece. They're a little bit less fantastical, like cherubs or spirits or gods or something, and they're actually just regular women, and the women are nude while the men are not, and that injects it with an inevitable because of the male gaze and the frolicking about and the poetry of the scene. There's a little bit of implication of sexual or erotic interest in this scene, right? So you combine that little bit of change with the change in that it's not a biblical story, but one actually highlighting the strength of the Medici. And I like to point out, it's essentially like an advertisement, right? The Renaissance is the beginning of advertising, and in that already they basically see, like I like to say, that sex sells, right? In this scene, that's I like to say it's the beginning of understanding that if they show men with a certain amount of power or charisma, and then they're wearing Medici clothes, and then they're with these women, there's a little bit of an implication of success or something around. If you have these garments, you're going to have conquest and things. In any case, yeah, it's an interesting kind of shift and a different thing than what we've seen thus far in the Renaissance. Titian also has this famous piece of the Annunciation, or this piece on the Annunciation. Remember, the Annunciation is when Mary is told she's going to carry Jesus. Again, it's one of those scenes that a lot of artists do, but we see here a lot like Michelangelo's final Last Judgment piece. It's full of people. Also, it's not symmetrical. It's also got really bright areas and really dark areas. Things are starting to change. And again, this is 1560, so we're moving in to the late Renaissance, where we're going to see a lot more of this asymmetry, diagonal composition, and drama, light and dark, that are they're going to change the Renaissance, as we get to the end of the Renaissance. So definitely worth noting and comparing, the layers. This is almost like explosive, the way the angels are coming down to speak to Mary, versus like the more subtle images that we saw before that, in the images we see of Da Vinci. We'll talk about it more in a minute. But yeah, Titian kind of represents this shift as an artist from Venice. But before we get to the late Renaissance, we have to touch on the Renaissance in the North. So remembering that Renaissance style that evolved gradually out of the late Middle Ages, and artists increasingly became interested in the details of the visible world and better capturing them. But the Renaissance, the Northern Europe did it in ways that are a little bit different from the artists in Italy. Right. And when you're talking about the Renaissance and it's like rebirth of Roman and Greek philosophy and things, remember that Italy was Rome, at one point. It was Roman. But Northern Europe is a little bit more disconnected, and it has its own historical history, that's different than Rome. Okay, so it leads to some different things. And we see art. Remember that too, the church started in Rome, the church made its way to Europe. So there's a little bit less of a focus, although there's obviously is a focus on Christianity and how it spread throughout Europe, like we talked about in chapter 15, but there's some focus on some other things as well. Like we talked about the fairy tales and the of the princess and the unicorn, and then we talked about King Arthur and like some other things that are sort of non-biblical. We see more of that in Northern Europe. Also remembering that they have less written history and less philosophy in their background. It's just more illustrative history. Okay. In any case, so starting off with the Limburg brothers, they were the little hours, or the rich hours. Basically is a piece, or it's a set of pieces about the calendar. We talked about calendars in one of the churches in France, and we see that, again, one of the common art types that we see, or art genres that we see outside of church art, is calendar art, right? Because remember, again, these people didn't necessarily keep up with the calendar as much as they would go and they would be, they would be taught things more through illustration. Again, in any case, the Limburg brothers have this calendar that they create, which is a little bit more celestial, if you might say, than a lot of the more Catholic church types, right? It is Catholic, but there's just a different focus than down in Italy. And what we see is images in these calendars of what the regular people, right? And that's an important, what regular people are doing in different times of the year. So we see here, this would be obviously some winter scene, and we see the peasants, there's snow everywhere, and the food is limited, and life is just a little bit harder, versus over here, this is obviously some sort of springtime, sort of triumphant, everything's green, everything's beautiful, right? And these scenes represent what life is like in Northern Europe at these different times of year. And again, it's important that they're not church related, and it's also important that they're regular people, right? There's just a different focus in the North. In any case, looking at some like more church oriented art, let's look at the Merode altarpiece. Remembering, looking at this is what's called a triptych, and I talked about before that altarpieces are either done in Northern Europe as things that could actually be moved around. They're like movable walls or little like screens. So this piece is actually the way that a lot of altarpieces work, like this one, is that there's this large center panel, and the two side panels actually close in. They are hinged and close like a door, and you can almost move this whole altarpiece like a suitcase or something. But what it creates is three different panels, and when you have three different panels, that is what's called a triptych, a composition consisting of three panels side by side, generally hinged, so the outer panels can shutter over the central one. Sometimes it's a diptych, where it's just two panels that can close up. Sometimes the wings aren't even always, connected with the hinge and stuff like that. But in any case, we do see here this sort of different telling of the Annunciation. It's a little bit less dramatic, and there's what we see here is that perspective. There's a few things. Number one, let's talk about perspective. Perspective is happening, but it's a little bit more like the pre-Renaissance era of it. It's intuitive. It's what they say Campion relied on, intuitive perspective, where everything is going back and it is converging within a scene, but it's not necessarily going back to the same horizon or back to the same point. There's a little bit of there's less organization, there's less control in this the Northern Europeans version of perspective, right? We also see, also this kneeling man is almost as big as the door. These figures are both very, they're all large in terms of their relationship, their proportion to the room. Now, what is also something different that I like to point out in Northern art is there's a lot more kind of hidden symbolism. We've talked about iconography before, and the iconography here, it's like storytelling, through little subtle things like that the candle has blown out, right? That's this symbolizing of the Holy Ghost, right? That we see. We see this little baby Jesus angel shooting towards Mary's belly. We also see Joseph over here in the right frame is actually building. He's a carpenter, right, which we know is part of the story, but he's building a mousetrap, and that's sort of supposed to symbolize that Jesus is the trap that's going to capture Satan. And all these little subtle symbols are an important part of the story of these pieces, right? So there's like more visual language. Also, it's worth noting, I feel like that Mary and the angel and the priest and all these characters are very much Northern European looking in these images, and that's not necessarily, I think, an intentional thing. It's just more by virtue of who was around them, in a way. Now, of course, Joseph does look somewhat like not Northern European, but there's I don't know, there's a discussion to be had there over the fact that Mary and the angel are both blonde haired and pale, and so I don't know, but it is interesting to start noticing these differences, and just in general, I want to talk about how, whereas Italian masters were obsessed with structure, the inside, remember, they studied the anatomy of the human body, they studied organs and musculature and things like that. They studied accurate perspectives, yes, and studied anatomy. But Northern artists generally focused their skill on rendering the precise outer appearance of subjects. So the proportions are less accurate, the perspective is less accurate, but the surfaces are very complex and delicate and just well-crafted surfaces when painted in Northern Europe. And yeah, so again, we see perspective happening and it's a little better, but it's just not quite right. The perspective, the proportions are not completely developed as much as they are getting to be in Italy. So that's worth kind of noting the difference again. And again, we've already talked about Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini wedding, and again, I'm just touching base. If you want to go back and see, we talk about it in the section about iconography, but we talked about how the shoes symbolized and domesticity as well as the dog. The oranges symbolize that the groom here is some sort of merchant, right? They're well off enough to have candles, but not enough to have all the candles lit, right? And she is going to be able to bear children. There's all this like symbolism that becomes synonymous with the Renaissance in the North. Okay. Now, speaking of altarpieces that are famous and something that's a little bit different, we have Bosch, Hieronymus Bosch, who creates this painting about the Garden of Eden in the Garden of Earthly Delights is the name of this piece, and there's sort of this. It's a definitely. I feel like it's ahead of its time. It's almost like sci-fi ish. In nature, there's the piece that is the original, creation of Eve, for Adam to have the companion here in this beautiful garden full of animals. That's the first panel, and then the second panel is this sort of, procreated man, who's had the fruit and is now indulging in sort of lustful existence, right? It's basically party time here in the middle panel, and then the side panel is sort of an image of hell and the retribution, after living in sin or whatever you see here in the middle. But it's all pretty bizarre. I think it's, yeah. Let's take a look. Yeah, I have each scene. It's worth looking closer at some of the imagery that we see. It's not unfamiliar, or it's not unrelated possibly to Dante's Inferno, is kind of what I kind of see here, encapsulated in a lot of these images. This again, it's sort of fantastical, overly beautiful. There's unicorns and flying creature things in the garden, and then when you get to hell, it's just this straight the ears with knife going through it. There's this fish monster man eating people, and the man he's eating has bats flying out of his butt, and I don't know. It's just weird. And then he poops him out too. And I don't know. It's just all very bizarre. There's a man getting sawed in half somewhere on here. Oh, there's a man strung into the harp. Yeah, it's just really out there. And here we're going to look here at the party time. It's definitely meant to display like overindulgence, I think. Well, and again, there's this flying fish monster with a mermaid on its back. There's people performing acts with fruit, performing acts with each other, and other things. Um, yeah, it gets pretty wild, and I can't. A lot of it actually in Italy as well. We do see this is not that much different than the first piece that Michelangelo made of the demons attacking one of the saints, but the piece that's in the Kimball here in Fort Worth. But in any case, we do know it's not, again, not unrelated to the hellish story of Dante's Inferno, Dante Alighieri. But one of the things I like to talk about in looking at Bosch's painting, I always ask what these back things sort of look like to people, and they're very like ocean oriented. I think it looks like coral and things like that. There's a weird like Atlantis vibe to it, but I also can't help but feel like, for me, when I look at Bosch's piece here, I see a lot of like beakers and like scientific equipment, and just a general like science fiction-y kind of oriented focus on otherworldness. And I don't know, when I see it and think of the chemistry of it, I can't help but wonder, maybe during this time, during the Renaissance, the experiments they were doing with different kinds of paint, different kinds of pigment, were scientific in a way, and then were having an effect on the artists. And I'm talking about like a chemical effect on what the artists were picturing and seeing. But I feel like, I don't know, there's something to it looking like scientific equipment down here in this whole scene of like the knowledge of good and evil. And I don't know, it's just uh pretty good stuff. And it's got to, I'm sure we could spend an entire week just talking about this piece. That's definitely worth digging into. But for now, I'm just going to insert it as this well ahead of its time sort of thing. But another altarpiece that's worth talking about, Grunewald's Eisenheim altarpiece. This one's pretty cool because of the way it's set up. First off, again, the surfaces are pretty immaculate, very interesting in the way they're rendered here in this altarpiece. But it also shows a couple of the saints, a couple of the martyrs, represented, and so it's telling their story. There's a crypt sort of underneath, or the idea of a crypt, or a tomb where Jesus is going to be laid down. But what I like to point out about this one, it's 1515, so we're in the High Renaissance in Italy, but here in Northern Europe, we have, I guess it's, John is quoting that he will be last and Jesus will be first, I think is essentially the quote. But what we see here that's important in terms of the symbolism and story. That's kind of something they do more in the North. Is I always ask, like, how does Jesus look as compared to normal? And in this case, I would say Jesus looks very sick. He looks emaciated. He does not just look like he's been crucified, but he looks like there's some sort of, his skin is falling. He looks like a leper, right? He looks like some something more than just having been beaten, and there's something more. And it's what it needs to be connected to is this piece was actually at first displayed in a hospital for lepers, right? And I think it's an interesting way to think about the almost uh, evangelical storytelling or something. Basically, they could put this in the hospital for the lepers, and the lepers would look at Jesus and say that he looks sick, and yet he's redeemed, right? Right. The whole idea is that Jesus dies for the bad things that you do, and then these sick people are often told, in the world that they live in the 1500s, that they are sick because they're bad, right? And there's Jesus. He looks like them. He's sick like them before he dies. And this, like, kind of subtle connection between the people that this art piece is being shown to, and wanting them to be Christian, is definitely worth note there. But so yeah, that's the Eisenheim altarpiece. Also worth note in terms of talking about science in general. Durer, who we've looked at before, he does a lot of prints. He engages in this sort of, well, I would say it's pseudoscience, but it's just science at the time. Remember, they're just now figuring out that the Earth isn't flat. They're just now discovering America. And Durer, he believed that Northern art relied too heavily on instinct and lacked a firm grounding in theory and science. So towards the end of his life, he wrote two books that were really important on the philosophy of art and on the theory and science of art. Now, he was... I like to think of most of his art as like textbook art, right? It's telling a story, and even if sometimes the story is a little bit odd, like this piece here is actually about the whole idea. This is the four biles here on the left, and it's got Adam and Eve and four animals that represent different. Essentially, at this time in the 1500s, they believed that if you had a sickness, it's because you had too much of one bile or another, and that would make you too angry or too sad. If you were depressed, you had too much black bile. If you were angry, you had too much yellow bile, or so, stuff like that. And each bile was represented by a different animal and a different color, and it was sort of, yeah. It's interesting how much it connected with the visual elements, like and so it was well used in art. But yeah, that's what this piece is about. And so he's kind of studying. He's also the guy who did the piece about the rhinoceros. He painted the rhinoceros, and it looks like a giant like tank because it's interesting because, again, they didn't have photography, and he had not been to Africa. He was just trying to recreate the image, from like either a brief seeing one, on in a moving like zoo, or just basically mostly using descriptions of people who had seen rhinoceri. And so it's interesting. He also gets into a lot of like spiritual, like the Revelations and the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and anyway, connects them to the study of art, connects them to the science and study of things. But that's Durer, who yeah, well known for woodblock prints. But another element of, as we get to the end of the Renaissance, something that's happening in the North and eventually will have influence on Italy, is Hans Holbein the Younger. Here we see a couple things. Number one, in terms of the theory and science of art, here we have this skull that sort of, I've gotten to see this piece. It's huge, and it basically covers up a whole wall. And if you stand up here next to it and look at it from the side, while everything else is distorted, the skull will look perfectly accurate. It's like one of those distorted like sidewalk chucks. You got to stand at the right place and you can see it. But when you're looking straight on, it's all distorted. So that's a weird optical illusion-y type thing. We're just seeing some more bizarreness in Northern art. But also, one of the things we're seeing here, these are politicians being represented in this piece. And along with these politicians, we have a globe here, right? So that's a symbol of colonization, of the spread of European countries. We have lots of trade items. We also have this lute, which symbolizes, well, there's a couple there's the lute, and then there's a hymnal, and some of the writing of the Protestant church. Essentially, what we're going to see in looking at this, in addition to all of the advancements of colonization and politics and things, we're also seeing a shift in the church. And it's here symbolized by, again, this hymnal that is a Lutheran hymnal. Remember, Martin Luther introduces the idea that maybe Christianity is right, but Catholicism isn't right. So he begins the Protestant Reformation, and it's this religious movement of the 1500s. Again, Luther is German, so it begins in Northern Europe, and there is this attempt to reform the Roman Catholic Church. It's about your faith, not your acts, right? Which is a really way off of the like rote acts of the Catholic Church thus far, and it results in a lot of tension. While they're trying to change the way that the Roman Catholic Church is, they essentially split off and they become the Protestant churches, or the churches that protest, the Protestant churches. And this is known as the Protestant Reformation. So we start to see some of that in the art. And then actually, interestingly enough, as we get to the end of the Renaissance in Northern Europe, because of this shift towards the Reformation and then, or the Protestant Reformation, it basically, we go back to art that is more about regular life, right? Bruegel the Elder is showing harvesters here just living their regular life. And that is really key, again, talking about shifting from this focus on the church to focus on regular life in art in some new ways. Okay, so now that gets us up to the late Renaissance in Italy. This is basically the closing out of the Renaissance. Scholars generally, there it is, 1520. So Michelangelo continues to live and actually, I guess, does make art in the late Renaissance, but it's no longer high Renaissance art. But yeah, the date of the end of the High Renaissance in Italy is the death of Raphael in 1520. It's connected to the death of Raphael in 1520. And yeah, again, Michelangelo keeps going, but we already talked about how Michelangelo, after 1520, is not making the subtle art that we had been seeing prior. It gets more overwrought and dramatic. And that leads us to talking about mannerism. So as we move to the last 50 years, 50 or 60 years of the Renaissance, we begin a new type of art it's characterized by the dramatic use of space, dramatic light, typically more distorted, elongated figures, and really harsh colors. There's lots of contrast. There's really bright, overly, like these people's, their skin is so soft and delicate that it's not even real looking anymore. It's typically considered artificial and self-conscious. It's overdone. I like to think of this as like if the Michelangelo, Da Vinci, the high Renaissance guys were like, the Beatles and Elvis and like really like polished, like early rock and roll, which is funny because the whole deal was that it wasn't polished. It was just basic rock and roll, and then Bob Dylan folk music. All that is like high Renaissance, and then hair metal, which is all about the glamour and about being like a virtuoso on the guitar. Everything is super clean. I'm using music because I like to talk about music, but mannerism is hair metal. It's just too much, and you can like it for what it is, but it's not. It doesn't have the direct, like, simple joy of what we've seen or the impressiveness of what we saw in the early Renaissance. So we're also getting back to. You can see here more mythological stories. This is Venus, Cupid, Folly, and Time, all interacting here in this, like, it's like overly erotic. Even I think this is Time here in the back. His arm is like all twisted, right? So you see every muscle, even though it's like not even natural looking anymore. And I don't know. It's just, again, overdone for the art. Now that I'm saying it's overdone now because by contrast to what was done before, it was overdone. Of course, it becomes very likable as we get to the Baroque. But in any case, in addition to mannerism developing in the late Renaissance, after the High Renaissance, and that sort of overwrought painting style, we also have a shift in a couple things. Number one, one of the first female artists, the well-known in the European Western world, as well as one of the first female artists to gain a national, an international reputation, is Sofonisba Anguissolo. Anguissola, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that not quite right, but she is most known for her portraiture, right? And we've seen portraiture. We saw Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. Obviously, we've all seen that. We've seen some other portraiture done of royals and things. But what we see Anguissola do is here we see a portrait of her family, Amilcar, Minerva, and Asdrubale. Again, I'm sure I'm pronouncing it wrong, but it's her father, her sister, and her brother, as well as their dog. And this image of just the painter's family in this sort of tender familial situation. It's affectionate, it's domestic, it's common. It does have the atmospheric perspective of she's an Italian artist who I think she was born in Cremona and died in Palermo. But in any case, she she works in Italy and gains this reputation and kind of basically shows that there is open space for female artists in this world, as well as what she's kind of capitalizing on with it being normal and familial is as we've already talked about in the Northern Renaissance, we've already seen some art about regular people. So I kind of feel like, this is just me here, we're starting to see what will eventually be a pretty big rift and become almost like two opposing ways of making art that goes from now, or from then up until now in some ways, of like art that's like regular people versus art that is the big academic or church oriented or politically oriented art of any given time, right? So we're starting to see art about regular people. And in any case, so we have mannerism in portraiture developing as sort of different things, and mannerism feeds into another thing, another part of this shift towards the late Renaissance, which is the Protestant Reformation. Okay, so this is Tintoretto's Last Supper. So the Protestant Reformation pulls people away from the Roman Catholic Church, and then the church counters with this, what they call the Counter Reformation, in the second half of the 1500s into the 1600s. This Counter Reformation it's a reaction of the church to the Protestant Reformation, and it reaffirms the saints and the authority of the Pope, to which Protestants object. So the art of the Counter Reformation is more emotional and is meant to engage the hearts of the faithful. So basically, mannerism feeds into the Catholic Church deciding that it's going to make the hair metal refined, like super overdone, dramatic art. So we see here Tintoretto's Last Supper. We have a direct contrast to Da Vinci's, but right out of the gate, you can see in this piece, first off, we have 2-point perspective, right? We have perspective that it's diagonal, right? Or at least, even if this may be more like 1 point, but the point is not in the middle, right? This is not a symmetrical piece of art whatsoever. And there are parts of it that are in fact 2-point. And then the angels coming down again in this kind of like Titian's piece of the Annunciation. These angels, they're riding down on like laser beam lights, and the halo around Jesus is like physical in space, right? It's very dense. And in any case, there's also all this dramatic lighting that it's like super dark, where the light of Jesus is sort of like highlighting everything. It makes everything else look dark. And in any case, it's big, it's diagonal, it's asymmetrical, it's dramatic. There's high contrast, and that emotional, really highly exciting composition is meant to, in a way, pull people back to the Catholic Church and say, like, look how good it is. And so we compare that, the internalized, subtle, intellectual Da Vinci's Last Supper. What was that? It is now become externalized, exaggerated, and emotional in Tintoretto's Last Supper. So the dramatic use of light, theatricality, and heightened emotion, even the diagonal composition, will all play a prominent role in the style soon to be taken up across all Europe during the Baroque, which is our next chapter. So yeah, we look at the subtle 1 point perspective of Da Vinci's Last Supper, and we compare it to this angular diagonal composition of Tintoretto's Last Supper. And again, the contrast, the laser beam halos and angels flying dramatically through the scene. That it's the shift we see, and it's going to be awesome as we go to the Baroque. Now, capping off this chapter 15, we should also talk about Giorgio Vasari, who was a biographer, architect, and painter, and he wrote The Lives of the Most Excellent Architects, Painters, and Sculptors, published in 1550. Essentially, in the middle of the Renaissance, he becomes the first art historian, and so the guy for whom, in some ways, and I would say first art historian, he's kind of the first art historian as we know them modern in the modern world. He's the guy that made you have to take this class, right? No. Okay, and then after this, the slides just get into the repeat of the vocab. Now these slides are available online. Go check them out. I hope you enjoyed this part 2 of the Renaissance, and we will get into the Baroque in the next chapter. Thanks.